Okay, so Ukraine, it's been everywhere lately, hasn't? And I think we've all seen how much people want to understand, like where did this all come from? So that's what we're diving into today.
Right into it.
And we've got some excerpts here from Origins and History of Ukraine. And it's pretty amazing. Like it starts way back,
hmm
ancient times, and all the way to, what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it's a big sweep of history, isn't it? But we're not going to do a whole textbook thing here.
No.
We're picking out the good stuff. The most interesting parts, and honestly, the most important things to understand about Ukraine's story. So people come away, well, informed and hopefully, like they've learned something really cool.
I like that. Informed and intrigued. So right off the bat, the source talks about Ukraine's land, and it uses these descriptions, the gates of Europe and the cradle of many peoples and cultures.
Yeah, I love those.
They're powerful,
Yeah.
right? So when you read that, what's the first thing that pops into your head?
Well, to me, it just screams crossroads. Like when you say gates of Europe, it's all about geography, right? This place where East meets West and everyone's passing through trade, migration, armies, you name it. And then there's that cradle idea. And that's not just about movement. It's about roots. Different groups settling in, interacting, building their own distinct cultures, but all in this one place. And it just hits you, this history is going to be complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Layered, entangled. And speaking of layers, way back when, we've got the Scythians. Even Herodotus wrote about them. So what's the deal with those guys? Why are they important?
Well, I think what's cool is that even back then, you see this land connected to the wider world. We're talking ancient trade routes, the Scythians doing business with the Greeks down on the Black Sea coast. Imagine that. And they're fighting the Persians, so right away you see strategic importance, military stuff. It's all there from the very beginning.
Yeah. It's almost like setting the stage right. This territory is going to be fought over. It's going to be valuable. And then we've got the Slavs arriving. Now the source talks about archaeological evidence, placing their ancestral homeland right smack in what's now Ukraine.
That's a big deal.
It is, right? It's like this foundation, this deep connection that goes way, way back.
It definitely shuts down some of those arguments that try to minimize Ukrainian identity or claim it's something new. This shows it's anything but.
Exactly. All right, so fast forward a bit. We get to the medieval state of Russes. And the source paints this picture of Kyiv around the 11th century, this major European center, bigger than London or Paris back then, something like 100,000 people. That just blows my mind.
Right. It really shifts our perspective because we tend to, we focus on Western Europe in those times. But Kyiv, this was a powerhouse, strategically placed, major trade routes, think Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea, and culturally, huge religious center linked to the Byzantine Empire. That population number just drives it home how important Kyiv was.
But then, as often happens, things change. The Mongols. The source calls the 13th century invasion this turning point, that it really messed with the local nobility's ability to build a strong, unified state. Why was this invasion so impactful even centuries later?
I mean, brutal is an understatement, right? This wasn't just about immediate destruction. It was the fragmentation, the political chaos, and the ripple effects that lasted for generations. Power structures shattered, everything disrupted, and it left a void, this vulnerability to outside forces that would, unfortunately, become a recurring theme in Ukraine's story.
Which leads us to, a long period of being under someone else's thumb.
Right.
First Lithuania, then Poland, and eventually this huge Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth emerges 16th to late 18th century. We're talking like a vast chunk of Eastern Europe here. So how did this shape things for Ukraine?
Well, it's tricky. On one hand, being part of this major European power, it did open doors, trade, cultural exchanges, that kind of thing. But it also meant pressure to assimilate, not a lot of self-rule. But here's the thing. For many Ukrainians, especially those who were Orthodox Christians, they felt different. They felt marginalized within this Catholic-dominated Commonwealth. And I think it's in this period that we see those seeds of yearning for autonomy, for deciding their own fate.
And this is when the Cossacks come in.
Yeah.
Source calls them this Ukrainian phenomenon of free chivalry, which sounds so romantic.
Isn't it?
And the name itself, it comes from Turkic, meaning free men. They create this self-governing entity, the Hetmanate or the Zaporizhia host, with its own culture, military traditions. It's wild, like a state within a state. So how did this whole Cossack identity come about?
Well, you've got to picture the scene. Peasants fleeing serfdom, some lower nobility, they're all heading to this frontier land, looking for freedom, looking for opportunity. And it's this constant clash, this interaction with nomadic groups that creates this warrior culture, this fierce independence. They had to defend themselves, and they did it their way. They elected their own leaders, made decisions collectively. This was a serious military force, and they weren't afraid to use it, often becoming this buffer between bigger empires. It's fascinating.
Now, meanwhile, you've also got the Crimean Tatars and their Khanate.
Mm.
And the source says their relationship with the Cossacks was, well, it was complicated. Sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. And there's the Khan's palace in Bakhtjisaraj, this stunning reminder of their power back in the 16th century. So what was the dynamic between these two groups?
It was definitely a mixed bag. Like, there were times they teamed up against common threats, Poland, Russia, when it made strategic sense. But then, bam, they're raiding each other, fighting over resources, taking captives. The Crimean Khanate, this was no small-time operation. They had their own complex system. They were a force to be reckoned with, and their presence really shaped the whole Black Sea region. And it's important to remember the Khanate eventually gets absorbed into the Russian Empire, and that has big consequences for the Cossacks, too, changes the whole game.
Right, so by the late 18th, early 20th century, Ukraine is basically split between these two empires, Austro-Hungarian and Russian. But even without their own country, the source makes a point of saying that Ukrainians were still like active players in European life, serving in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting for rights, building businesses, even advancing science and technology and culture. So how do you have this, on one hand, suppression of Ukrainian identity under imperial rule, but also this flourishing?
It's a push and pull, right? Like, within the Russian Empire especially, there was this real effort to suppress Ukrainian language, culture, the whole thing. But that very act fueled this growing sense of national consciousness among Ukrainians. It's like the more you try to stamp it out, the stronger it gets. They were writing, researching, preserving their heritage and all this while participating in wider European events, encountering new ideas. And then you've got economic development, cities growing, new social structures emerging. It's like this identity is being forged in the fire.
And then, boom, the 20th century hits. The source doesn't mince words. It calls it stormy, which I think is putting it mildly. World War I breaks out. And all of a sudden, there's this chance for a Ukrainian nation state between 1917 and 1921. And they even fight back against the Bolsheviks near Warsaw, alongside Poland, successfully. It feels like, what if? What if this had held? Why didn't it?
It was a moment, wasn't it? Like, the empires crumble and there's this opening and this possibility. And Ukrainians, they grab it. They declare independence. They fight. And the Battle of Warsaw, that shows they're serious. They're willing to stand up. But they're facing incredible odds, internal divisions, a brutal civil war. And then, well, the Bolsheviks. They just had more firepower in the end.
And that's how Ukraine ends up part of the USSR until 1991. And this Soviet period, I mean, the source calls it a time of terrible tragedies and challenges, and it's heartbreaking. You've got forced collectivization, which leads to the Holodomor, the Great Terror, the Holocaust, where 1.5 million Jewish people from Ukraine were murdered, deportations, the Gulag, all of it. It's almost too much to process. So what was the thinking behind this level of repression?
Well, at the core of it, you have this totalitarian ideology. It's this idea that they're building a communist utopia, but to do that, they have to reshape society completely by force if necessary. So you get these policies like collectivization, which was meant to crush independent farmers, seen as a threat. The Holodomor, this was a deliberate famine, a way to control the population through starvation. And then the Great Terror, it was about eliminating anyone perceived as an enemy, real or imagined. And the Holocaust, this horrific genocide, unfolding on Ukrainian soil, targeting Jewish people, but also others. It was a system that valued ideology above human life.
But, and this is important, the source also highlights the achievements of this period. Like, there's no denying the industrialization, the advancements in space technology, nuclear power, medicine, even early computers, and Ukrainian art and culture, even with all the censorship, it was still making waves globally. So how do we make sense of this mix of horror and progress?
It's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because, yes, the Soviet regime inflicted unimaginable suffering, but it also pushed for modernization, and that did lead to some improvements for some people. Heavy industry, technology, these were priorities. And even in the arts, while so much was controlled, there were still artists and intellectuals who found ways to create, to push boundaries, and their work had a global impact. It's this strange contradiction that even within such a repressive system, there's this drive for innovation, for expression. But, and this is key, we can't forget the human cost. Those achievements were built on immense suffering.
And then there's World War II. The source says Ukraine was at the heart of it, twice. First under Nazi occupation, then during the fight to push them back. 8 million Ukrainians dead, mostly civilians, between 39 and 45. That's just, I mean, there are no words. Ukrainians fought on different sides and different armies. And the truth about all this, it was buried for decades, until the late 80s. Why was Ukraine such a battleground? And why this silence for so long?
Well, strategically, Ukraine was essential. Resources, location, it was key for both the Nazis and the Soviets. The Nazi occupation, I mean, it was brutal. Violence, forced labor, the Holocaust. And then when the Soviets pushed back, the fighting was intense, just devastating for civilians. And the silence afterward, it was part of the Soviet narrative control, the Great Patriotic War, this unified story that downplayed the specific experiences of different republics, different groups. Ukrainians fought bravely on different sides, but that didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't until the late 80s that those stories could finally be told.
After the war, the source talks about this continued resistance, even under Soviet rule. Independence fighters, human rights activists, dissidents, they all played a part in the eventual collapse of the USSR and Ukraine's independence in 1991. There's that Monument of Independence in Kyiv, such a powerful symbol. What did this resistance look like during those Soviet years?
It was a long, often hidden struggle. You had armed groups right after the war, but also this persistent underground movement. Dissidents speaking out, risking everything for basic rights, for Ukrainian culture and language. It was dangerous. People were imprisoned, exiled, even killed. But that desire for freedom, for self-determination, it never died out, and it helped chip away at the Soviet system, ultimately creating the conditions for independence.
And since then, the source points to key moments: the Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, these massive displays of people power, this commitment to democratic values. And then in 2019, European and Euro-Atlantic integration, it's written right into the Constitution. So what does all this tell us about Ukraine's path since independence?
To me, it's about agency. It's about choosing their own future. The Orange Revolution, that was about fair elections, about saying no to corruption. The Revolution of Dignity, it was about saying no to authoritarianism, about embracing Europe, about the kind of society they wanted to build. And that integration into the Constitution, that's a long-term vision, a statement about where they want to be.
Which brings us to today. The source talks about this peaceful coexistence, all these different people living together, until Russia takes Crimea in 2014. And then this ongoing aggression, this hybrid warfare, the casualties, the military buildup, it's heavy stuff. And it ends by talking about Ukraine's fight for its freedom, for its democracy, right there in Europe. So given this huge, complex history, how do you see this current conflict?
You can't separate it from the past, can you? It's this continuation of a struggle that's been going on for centuries. Russia's actions, they're a direct challenge to Ukraine's sovereignty, their right to choose. And the way Ukrainians are resisting, it's rooted in this long history of standing up to outside pressure, of fighting for their identity. This isn't just about land, it's about values, it's about democracy versus authoritarianism, about independence versus empire.
So wow, that was a lot. Ukraine's history, it's this epic story full of incredible achievements, but also unbelievable suffering. And it just shows you the strength, the resilience of the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely. I think the big takeaway here is that Ukraine's story, it's been shaped by its location, this crossroads, this meeting point of different worlds. And that's created this unique identity, this ability to adapt, to resist, to hold on to who they are.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how does this past all these triumphs and tragedies, how does it shape what's happening now and what will happen in the future? It's a question worth pondering. And for anyone who wants to dig even deeper, the source we used mentions this introductory course on Ukrainian history and culture. That sounds like a great next step.
Yeah, if you're hooked, definitely check it out. There's so much more to learn.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring.
And keep asking those questions.
And see you then.